Well, welcome everyone to this webinar to mark the first anniversary of the death of George Floyd. When we ask 1 year on, has anything shifted and what must happen next? First of all, I need to pay tribute to Bob Marley for starting us off there. If you haven't listened to Bob Marley's songs recently, then my goodness, are they prophetic for our time? And I thoroughly recommend acquainting yourself with Bob's songs. Well, if you've been half listening to the news or watching the TV over the past year, it might seem as if the issue of racism has really never gone away. We've had worldwide protests. We've had footballers taking the knee. We've had the Meghan Markle interview, of course. We've had the issues of disparities in the impact of COVID on people of colour. We've had, unfortunately, further police shootings of unarmed black men. We've also had some wonderful documentaries, one from the Channel 4 called The Talk, and a lovely series, a really profound series from Steve McQueen, the Small Axe series. If you haven't watched those yet, make sure you do while they're still available. There's some very profound lessons from those. And of course, there's the Sword Report, affectionately known by some as the Sewage Report, that seems to turn backwards the clock in terms of our understanding of institutional discrimination and the acceptance of systemic racism in our society. So have we made progress? Can we actually say to Gianna Floyd, George's young daughter, that your daddy has changed the world? Well, that's the question we are asking our panel today. First of all, just to introduce myself, my name's Adrian Locke, and I'm the founding director of the Deeper Leaders Collective, a group of leadership and OD consultants and executive coaches who all share a passion to develop the leadership we need in organizations and in society for a kinder, fairer, and more sustainable world. And I'm delighted to say that I'm joined by Simon Gott, another member of the collective, who will be helping with the questions and the panel chat at the end. A bit more from him in a few more minutes. But more importantly, let me introduce you to our expert panel. First of all, we have one of the most respected and outspoken Black academics in the UK. He's also a BAFTA award-winning documentary filmmaker, having written and presented over 20 films for the BBC. And if you could just mute yourselves as you come in, that would be great. Over 20 films for the BBC, Channel 4 and Discovery USA. His current research is a practice-based theology of music, which inscribes Black and womanist theologies into urban music genres. I probably need a PhD to try and understand even the title, but please welcome virtually Professor Robert Beckford, Professor of Black Theology at the Queen's Foundation. It's great to have you with us. We also have Suzann Douglas, integrative counsellor and author of the book Dear Piers Morgan, with us. Now, her book, which I thoroughly recommend to you, combines her passion and counselling training insight and hours of research to demonstrate the process of building implicit racial bias from the cradle to adulthood. And it's a very personal book and thoroughly recommended. Now, we're reliably informed that the producer of Good Morning Britain handed a copy of Suzann's book to Piers Morgan just a few weeks before he walked out of Breakfast TV. So we not only have to welcome Suzann, we need to congratulate her on her success as well. And thirdly, we have James Clarry, the COO of Coutts, one of the world's oldest banks, which he describes as a 330-year-old startup and the indispensable partner for the wealthy and influential. James is also diversity champion for the bank and co-chair of the NatWest Group's Ethnicity Allies. Welcome, James. So let's take a quick look at our agenda for the next hour or so. We start with our first question, which is a very personal question to our panel. What was the impact on you personally of the events of a year ago today when we learned and watched the horrific killing of George Floyd? Secondly, what has shifted, if anything, in your world since then? And thirdly, what must happen now, in your opinion? What are the top things that must happen now to make sure that George's death was not a waste in terms of being a catalyst and an impetus for change? After those three questions, I'm going to introduce an initiative that we are launching today at Deeper Leaders, the White Allies Network. More on that later. And then it's going to be open to the floor for questions, or from the chat function first of all, and then open to the floor. And I'm going to turn to Simon to explain how that's going to work in practice. Simon, over to you.
Yeah, thank you, Adrian. So as you're listening to our wonderful panel members answering the questions, if there are any questions that pop up for you along the way, please put them in the chat box and I will collect those questions and then field them when we get to the Q&A at the end. So please put all of your questions into the chat box and I'll collect those. We'll then run the Q&A towards the end of the session, and then we'll also have an open mic session towards the end where you can just jump in and ask your own question. Thank you, Adrian.
Great. And just one other thing to add on that front, that we will stop recording just before the open mic session. We are recording everything up to that point. In case there's anyone who wants to ask a question that would prefer not to be recorded after that. And so that will be coming up soon. So I'm going to ask Simon if he would highlight our panel members for me. So that we can get straight into those questions. So once they are spotlighted, I think we're good to go. I think we are. Excellent. Fantastic. Well, welcome all three of you once more. So let me just start with Robert, actually, on that very personal question. Looking back a year ago, the events that unfolded, what was the impact on you personally, would you say?
Yeah, it's a really good question to kick off with. I'd say three things. First of all, I wasn't surprised. I'm from Birmingham, and we have a long history of seeing black men murdered by state authorities, police in particular. My first encounter with this was in 1978 when Clinton McKervin, a young man, went into Next, the shop, to look at some clothes. They accused him of stealing. It turned out it wasn't the case. The police came along and strangled him. In essence, there was never any comeback for that. There was never any prosecution. So that was in our consciousness. Clinton McKervin is a relative of the poet Benjamin Zephaniah. Every occasion Benjamin Zephaniah gets, he raises this unsolved crime. So I wasn't surprised in that sense. Secondly, look, state violence against black people is built into Western culture. You know, Kindy Andrews' latest book, you know, A New Age of Empire, explores that theme. You can't talk about Western civilization, civilization in quotes, because you know, it was civilization for other people who experienced it. You can't talk about it without talking about the way in which racial terror is carved into that history and understanding. Do I think something has shifted? Yes, but if I use Audre Lorde's three-part understanding of change process, she said we move from silence on a subject to developing a language around it, and then moving from that language into action. I'd say we're in the middle phase of at least contemplating developing a language of inclusivity, racial justice, anti-racist praxis, but the challenge is to move into that state of action, and that requires structural change, planning, organization, renunciation of power, change and shift in resource and planning, and that's always the big question. So it's a Kairos moment.
Thanks, Robert. So we'll hear more. We'll let you unpack some more of that a little bit later in terms of those second and third questions. But Suzann, over to you. What was the impact on you personally of the events of the year? Well, you've just muted yourself, or by accident. There we go. Yeah.
There we go. Yeah. So yeah, I mean, I found the video, I'm sure like many on this call, I found it really shocking. I found it traumatic, horrific. I mean, you know, I've not been able to watch it again. So I watched it once and I've never returned. So if I see it, you know, if I hear it, I'm not sure what happened. I got muted again. But yeah, if I hear it come on again, you know, if I hear it come on the TV, I have to switch off because I find it horrific. But, you know, when you sent the questions, Adrian, I really sat down and thought, okay, what was the impact on me personally? So I really wanted to just explore what I felt. In exploring, I felt there was an unexpected emotion. So there was an emotion I felt in contrast that was contrary to the bulk of the emotion I felt. And that was that I felt a sense of relief. And relief is a really strange word to use, you know, with such horrific circumstances. So in thinking about why did I actually feel relieved? And I feel it's because when you're talking about racism, or you're trying to express or convey the dynamic of racism, it's such a hard dynamic to convey or be received by the hearer. Unless, you know, you have experienced it personally or you have awareness of it. But for me, on that day, I think there's something really powerful, you know, when we see something as humans, when we see something reflected back to us. And so for me, on that day, there in front of us was a dynamic of racism. You know, we had Derek Chauvin, the cop, kneeling on top of George Floyd. He was completely disconnected from George's pleas, from his knees, from his cries. And for me, that's the dynamic, you know, that dehumanization, disconnection. And so for me, the relief, to use, you know, this strange word, was that, you know, now everyone can see, now people can see.
Right. Thanks, Suzanne. We're getting a bit of disturbance in the background. Can I just ask that everyone mutes their mic unless it's one of the panel speaking? Thank you, Suzanne. James, same question to you. What was the impact on you personally?
Thank you, Adrian, and good afternoon, everyone. While the other two were talking, I was just having a look at our participants today, and one of our participants has got a fantastic virtual background that comes up, which says, "Justice will not be served until those who are unaffected are as outraged as those who are." And I think that conveys, I guess, one of my thoughts on this. And bear with me, because I have to admit that I didn't see the footage for months. A lot of people talked about it. I don't tend to look at things just because people talk about it. And I didn't actually see very much coverage of the death itself. But it was the reaction of colleagues and friends, and of course, the millions of people who took to the streets, that I think I experienced George Floyd's murder through. And that's an odd situation. It's a bit like when you remember a family holiday that you went on. Do you remember the holiday, or do you just remember the photos that you've had of the holiday? And therefore, I do wonder whether the personal impact on me is more through the telling of the story from others. And as a bank, we organised a whole series of listening sessions over last summer, where we invited people to talk about their perspectives on the murder and their perspectives on racism and discrimination and bias and oppression. And as a result, I definitely think that I view that whole event through the lens of what people said. People were numb, were desensitized, they felt powerless. There were so many people who, whilst, as Robert said, they were not shocked because it's part of their history. It's not just part of the history they see on the news, but actually it's part of what they themselves have experienced. So many people of global majority heritage had similar stories, issues of safety. So many friends and family members being stopped by the police in the UK. And one particular colleague of mine referred to a Michael Jackson song, "No One Really Cares About Us," as how she felt that actually she didn't expect the police to be brought to justice. And final thought on that, Adrian, of course, whilst we've since seen the trial of the officers in George Floyd's case, there are so many other deaths of young Black men and women where we haven't seen justice. And I was particularly shocked, horrified by the accounts for Elijah McClain, an utterly appalling case in 2019, also died after being put in a chokehold. when he was politely asking them to respect his boundaries as an introvert. I have never been stopped by the police, and I've never been subject to that level of brutality. But my heart really went out to this guy who played his violin to animals in a shelter to stop them feeling lonely, right? I could connect with this guy essentially being lynched by the police, and the 3 white police officers have still not been charged. So I think, to go back to the comment that I made at the beginning, justice is not served until those who are unaffected are outraged. You know, I certainly feel outrage over that, but I think the outrage has been exacerbated by hearing how real this is, not just for people in the US, but also my colleagues in the UK as well.
Thank you, James. And I guess you probably started to touch on our second question, and maybe I'll stay with you to elaborate some more on that, which is, what's shifted in the world around you, in your organization, in your work and in your sphere of influence? You're going to mention some of the conversations you've been having in your work context, but say some more about the impact, how your organization and how you've responded as a result.
Yeah, thank you. So just for a bit more context, you introduced me as the Chief Operating Officer of Coutts. Coutts is a part of NatWest. NatWest, obviously, a very large employer, 55,000 people across the UK. And my story is not just of Coutts, but also, I guess, the reaction of NatWest. Yeah, I'm proud of the action that was taken by the bank, and it was very clear from our colleagues that they wanted action, not tokens. Immediately after the death, there were quite a lot of tokens. There were lots of people changing their websites or their Twitter account to put up a message of support. And within NatWest, actually, the approach was slightly different in that very quickly our CEO said, we're going to take some time to reflect on this and listen. And we appointed a task force that was led by 3 people of color who lead our multicultural network. And they took several months to really think about how we would respond. And they came out with 10 commitments actually in October, so quite a long time after it. Now, you could say that, you know, that means that we were slow to act. The alternative is that actually we spent time to actually listen to what the root causes of the issues were, so we could respond from a position of understanding rather than a position of sort of knee-jerk tokenism. And those commitments are quite far-reaching, Adrian. So, for example, we've had for some time a target for to get to 14% by 2025 in our senior leadership team of Black, Asian, minority ethnic. But of course, part of the reaction over the last few months has been a call for disaggregation, to stop treating people under that label. And so the task force committed to a separate target of 3% of our top management from the Black colleagues by 2025. Now, that's quite a big deal. We're currently only at 1%. So that requires a further 176 Black leaders to be appointed or recruited in the organization in the next 4 years. I'm proud as well, Adrian, because of just a couple of other things that came under that commitment. Of course, if we're going to hit that target, we're going to have to hire a lot more people from underrepresented areas. And so I was really pleased that last year, a lot of our programs, things like our interns program, our graduate program, our summer insights program, these are all places that we hire from, had a much higher proportion of people from global majority heritage. So, for example, 96% of our interns were Black, Asian, or minority ethnic. 33% were Black heritage. We need that because, frankly, if we're going to hit those targets, you need to have a disproportionate positive action to make a difference. And then the final, I could talk about our suppliers charter or increasing transparency through our voluntary ethnicity pay gap reporting. But the one that I'm personally responsible for is Ethnicity Allies. And Adrian, you're going to talk about the launch of your program later. But this idea we launched in October of anybody who wants to champion racial equality or fight racial discrimination to sign up to this network. And within 6 months, we had 2,000 colleagues make the pledge. Just to be clear, we're not saying that getting lots of allies involved is going to solve everything, but it certainly helps where you can raise awareness of issues of discrimination, help people to be advocates of colleagues, but also take action, positive action. And I'm really excited. I'm very positive about what we can achieve through that network. And it is about anti-racism, not passive bystanders. And there were a lot of people, Adrian, after George Floyd's death, who said, I'm not willing to stand by anymore. I need a vehicle to help me direct my activism.
Great. Thanks, James. Same question to Robert. What's shifted in your world?
Well, I get asked to do more of these events. That's one thing for sure. I would say I'm more pragmatic in terms of what's taking place. And I say that for two reasons. One, we've been here before. After the death of Stephen Lawrence in the mid-1990s, a lot of hand-wringing, a lot of soul-searching by secular and religious institutions about the state of race and racism within Britain. We had the Macpherson report as a consequence of that, which came out with some really, sorry, the Macpherson report was earlier, after Brixton, sorry. We had the, I've forgotten the Stephen Lawrence report. Scarman, there you go. We had the Scarman report. So we had Macpherson before. It's the so many reports, you see, you get lost in them, you know. Macpherson, you have Scarman. And so consequently, you know, even the Sewell report, I'm pragmatic in the sense I recognize that you'll have a rising consciousness, but that won't often result in the kind of structural change that's necessary. Why am I not optimistic, and why is my world, in a way, what I'm saying is it stayed the same, you know, cautiously hopeful, but realistically acknowledging there'll be very little change, is simply because the kind of transformation that needs to take place holistically. And I think it's great that companies are making a move, are trying to do something positive, are readdressing historical injustices and imbalances in terms of staffing and positioning within corporations. But we've got to look at the education system, look at the whole policing. You know, it's a 360-degree analysis. And I'm not saying, you know, you can't do that in segments, you can't do that in pockets, but the whole needs to be taken into consideration. And I think until you can get that kind of deep soul searching as a nation, we're always going to be experiencing starts and stops and almost. A good way to frame this and end with this is what the philosopher Cornel West describes as the difference between treating racism as a problem and a catastrophe. So the problem, then it's just a mental assent that's required, you know, a few things to work out and we'll solve it. If you see it as a catastrophe, then you have to do the emotional work as an individual, as a nation, to work through it and to really do the deep existential wrestling to overcome it. And I think at the moment it's still in the first category. It's a problem. It's not seen as a human catastrophe that we have to make sense of.
Right. So do you think anything, just staying with you, Robert, for a minute, do you think anything's been different about the death of George Floyd, though, compared with other kind of things that have jolted us into more of awareness? I know you're not completely optimistic, but is there anything which makes you slightly more optimistic than before?
Sure. Two things. It's taught about the importance of having a phone camera, because these things have been happening. You know, my current research is it's really about gospel music, but gospel music, that's just a bit more holistic, includes a socio-political critique within it. One of the tracks has a music video, which is just a collage of the people who have been recently, in the last 50 years, Black people have been killed in police custody. You know, it's called the incarnation, because we're questioning what the incarnation means in light of this terrible history. So it's taught us about the value of being able to record these things, because Black and brown people have been complaining about it. You know, young Black men have been talking about the policing, and we've been talking about deaths in custody. We've been singing songs about deaths in custody since the 1980s. So it's not new. I am hopeful because the biblical text demands that we have a hope against hope, the Apostle Paul calls it, which isn't the hope that the world has. It's a heavenly hope. So I've always got heavenly hope because I believe in my resurrected Lord and Savior. I believe that God will do it either inside of time or outside of time. So what I'm saying is, I'm cautious. I'm 55. I've been here before. I was here in the 1980s. I was here in the 1990s. I was here in the early noughties. You know, and the chances that, you know, God spare life, as my mother would say, we'll be doing the same thing in 10 years' time. So what's important for me is thinking in terms of political theory. What gains can we make now that give us a platform for next time? That's what we're looking for. The gains, because we know there's pushback. Sewell report was pushback.
Okay, right. Thank you, Robert. You remind me of something I heard Archbishop Desmond Tutu once say when he was asked, is he optimistic about the future of South Africa? And he said, no, but I'm addicted to hope. And there is something about holding on to hope, and despite some of the setbacks that we've seen. Suzann, I'm going to turn to you now for that question. So what's shifted in your world? And I think you want to share a few slides with us at this stage. Is that right?
Yeah, I do. So I was just going to say there's been a shift across the entire spectrum of life. So in the international bank that I've worked for 10 years, in the world of counselling, I know in our local church community, we've done some work, you know, creating safe spaces to have discussions about race. So across the whole spectrum of life. So in terms of the counselling side of things, so obviously as a counsellor, you need to be supervised. And I never forget a supervisor of mine saying to me once that, you know, unless the profession changes, it will be just filled with white middle class people like herself. So she felt there was a huge change to be made in the profession. And then what happened was, as a result of, you know, in response to the death of George Floyd, the BACP, so that's the British Association of Counselling and Psychotherapy, they held a series of roundtable meetings. So the meetings were with the board, with the chairman, some of the board, stakeholders and members, and each meeting would be about 12 up to 30 people. And I was invited to attend those meetings. So that felt like a real, an honour, firstly, but also a real pivotal moment of change. You know, this age-old profession actually looking at tangible ways that we can bring change to the profession. And then, as Robert says, you know, it's opened the way for more conversations. So as an author, so the reason I wrote the book in the first place was the training as a counsellor was life-changing, but also hugely challenging. And, you know, I started the training with other professionals, and by the end of it, there were hardly any of us left. And I didn't blame anyone that left, because the challenge is when you start to train as a counsellor, you start to tap into information that you've, you know, ingested over years, but much of which sits at, you know, at an unconscious level. And that process is hugely uncomfortable, because it starts to change your view on yourself, on your relationships, on the world. And that's the challenge of, you know, the journey. And there are many counsellors that compare that journey, you know, to the film The Matrix. You take the blue pill, you wake up in your bed and the story ends, but you take the red pill, and I'll show you how deep the rabbit hole goes. So when I was, so what happened was, obviously that journey, I feel it gave me empathy for the process of building unconscious bias, because I learned that at the end of the day, we're all products of our environment. And the information that we've taken in, you know, is unconscious, and it can really powerfully motivate us. So I wanted to share that insight in a book. And whilst I was thinking about the process of writing, I saw this headline article by Piers Morgan, and it was complaining about Meghan playing the, you know, the despicable race card. And so when I read that, I felt I wanted to respond, but in a non-judgmental, empathetic way, to actually evidence, you know what, it's so easy for any of us to have this bias and be unaware and operate out of it. And so the writing, you know, journey began. And I thought it might be useful today to share. So what I did in order to write the book, I incorporated lots of counselling models and then also wider research. So I thought it might be helpful today to share one of the models that I've included in the book. So hopefully, can you see the screen?
Yeah.
Yeah, okay. So this is transactional analysis. So this theory is really useful when you're trying to understand organizational behavior or interpersonal relationships or social interaction. And so the theory works on the premise that when we're growing up, we absorb voices from authority figures around us. And then what happens is these messages, they then present themselves as a set of thoughts, feelings, attitudes, or behaviors. So the theory explores how our unconscious ego states get activated, when we're communicating. So we've got 3 ego states. We've got the parent, the adult, and the child ego state. And the parent and the child ego state, they have a positive and negative attribute. So the parent ego state, so we've got the nurturing parent. So I'm sure that speaks for itself when you think of the nurturing thoughts, feelings, and attitudes that can be going on in your brain, in your mind or towards other people. Or you've got the critical parent, and that's where people talk about, my inner critic. And then we've also got the child state. So we've got the free child, and that's where we can be, creative, authentic, playful. And we've got the adaptive child. That's where we can be complicit or scared or compliant. So obviously not obviously, but the ideal state would be if we were to operate, when you're looking at organizational behavior or social interaction, if we were to operate at an adult to adult level. So you hear that phrase, let's talk adult to adult. So in this state, we're rational thinking, we're questioning, we're problem solving, we're helping and fact finding, we're really being in the present moment and responding to life around us. So it would be ideal if we operated adult to adult, or even if we operated from an ego state to the ego state that the receiver was receptive to operating out of. But I'm sure you can imagine that doesn't happen. And we get what are called cross transactions. We end up with conflict, so when you're looking at organizations. And so just looking at the theory, expanding on and looking at how we start to think about race. So in transactional analysis, we call it cultural scripting. Another word you could use is cultural identity. So these are the messages we receive about culture and race from family or wider society. So cultural scripting actually influences those parent-child narratives that are taking place towards ourselves and towards other people. It need not be deliberate or consistent, but merely sufficient enough to reinforce already habituated patterns established by the family. So there's a really useful research by Marie Norton. So she's a British psychiatrist, and Keith Tudor, he's an Australian professor, and they have written a paper called Being White. So they've done lots of research and they've written a paper called Being White, and they talk about some of the messages that are shared in the white family. So maybe around the dinner table, and these messages or the scripts might be, least said, soon as mended, or we're not responsible for the slave trade, or 2,000 years of patriarchy, and so on. And what they explore is when the individual, so they're both white themselves, and they explore when the individual is exposed to these messages, what happens is effectively they're groomed into a role of bland neutrality and passivity. They benefit from their privileged place in society, yet actually taking no responsibility for understanding, how did this status quo come about? Therefore, they act out the dynamics of assumed privilege, but at the same time, an incipient guilt and anxiety about their involvement and exploitation in racism. And the final slide, so this is looking at in-group and out-group narratives. So some of the out-group narratives that we see in the press are, the Muslim problematic or the illegal immigrant, or looking at stereotype racial awareness. So this is how we start to become aware of stereotype and race. So lots of people will say, I don't see race or I don't see color, but actually the research shows that by the age of 6 years, 18% of children can already introduce an individual stereotype. By the age of 10 years, 93% of children are able to infer an individual stereotype. And there's quite a bit of research out there on this, but this process actually happens in 3 stages. So by the age of 2, a child already learns to perceive and label racial differences. By the age of 3 to 6, they've already got the first positive and negative evaluation, so they're already apparent. And by the age of 6 to 8, there's already a gradual intensification of in-group and out-group preferences, and prejudices. So they're already observing the world around and seeing who's important, who's not, who's in and who's out. And so that's just one of the models that's out there on this. And I thought it would be useful to share. You know, if you are interested, the book, as Adrian has said, is called Dear Piers Morgan.
Well, thanks ever so much, Suzanne. That's fantastic to bring that insight from your areas of expertise into that, and thoroughly recommend that book, as I said. Let's move on then to our third question, shall I? Which is, okay, so stuff has shifted. Some of it perhaps less than we would want it to have done, but certainly things have been shifting in our worlds. What needs to happen next? That's our third question, in order to make sure this is really a change moment. The moment turns into a movement of fundamental change in our society. And so I'm just going to kind of offer it out there to all three of you, really. What needs to happen next, in your opinion? And it might be in your work context, it might be your personal opinion, but over to you. Who'd like to go first on that one? Robert. Yeah.
Sure. Yeah, I think we need to go back to school and a new 3 R's. You know, the first R is re-education, because what is at the heart of racialized oppression is ignorance, and not only in terms of individual ignorance, but societal ignorance, and also ignorance of history. And we even are blessed in this country that we even have the institutionalization of ignorance. Look at the Sewell report. So we've got a lot of relearning to do, and that's one of the good things about what's taking place. Is there's been a real interest in people buying books, educating themselves, particularly people racialized as white, educating themselves and recognizing that there's some learning to do. The second R, I think, is for Christian people, is about repentance. Because once you've done the education, you realize that there's some personal work to do in terms of recognizing how you may have been complicit. Men have to do this when you become conscious of the way in which patriarchy works. You know, I've been a part of upholding patriarchal systems. I have to repent. And the good thing about repentance in the biblical tradition, when Jesus tells people to repent, he says, don't do it anymore. You know, so he's not just saying, feel good about yourself, you know, you're okay. Don't do it. And that leads to the third R then, which is about restructuring or redistribution of resources or reparation, you know, but you need to then ensure that there is structural change so that you can make sure that the change that you believe should take place does take place. It filters down. And if I can throw in a fourth R, I went to a state school, you see, so 3 R's became 4. There you go. You know, it's the beauty of a comprehensive school education. 3 becomes 4. You know, I should knock state education, actually. So it was a good state school. You know, Christian people are required to take the risk of faith, you know, and that means we're meant to be different. We're meant to be seen to be different. We're meant to exemplify what heaven is going to be like. So I think it's those 3 R's, but undergirded by this risk of faith, because we know how the story ends. We've been told how it ends when we are finished on this planet and how the big story ends. So we can take those risks.
Thank you, Robert. James, shall we turn to you next? What's
Well, I'll only add one because I thought that was a great answer, and I'll stick with the school theme. So if Robert's R, then I'll do E, right? So this is about religious education. My E, my 1E is about empathy. And I'm picking up on a question that's actually been put in the question board, because I think it's a terrific question. And that is, you know, how do you help people? There are those who want to be allies, but how do you deal with people who don't want to? I think one of the issues is that if you walk down the high street and ask 1,000 people, do they believe that everyone is equal? They're going to say yes. And then they may confuse their belief that everyone is equal with the fact that there is equality, because they're not the same thing. Equality is a fact. Equal is a human right. So you've got lots of people who will say, yeah, I agree that everyone's equal, and they assume, therefore, there is equality. But there isn't. And in order to understand that there isn't equality, people need to have an empathy for what it feels like to suffer from inequality. And the problem with a lot of this narrative is that many people just don't experience what it's like to be from a minority background if they their only experience is a majority background, right? And so there needs to be, some people will describe that as privilege. I don't mind saying, I know that Kemi Badenoch said that we're not allowed to teach about white privilege without providing a balanced experience. I'm not teaching, I'm not in school, I'm just going to tell you my experience. I definitely have white male privilege. I definitely have it. I have things that I have not earned that I get because I'm a white man. And therefore I really suffer to understand what it's like to either be a woman or to be black or from a global majority heritage background. I've got 4 kids, 3 of which are daughters, and I have a wife, so I can speak to them and I can understand what their experience is. And that often compels male allies, i.e. feminists, men who want gender equality, to take action. The issue is that most white people will struggle to get that experience, that empathy from others, unless they take the time to listen. And a lot of people won't take the time to listen. One of the reasons being they're scared. I'm not saying they're physically scared. They're scared of saying the wrong thing. And it's one of the most common things that people say is, I want to get involved in the narrative, but it will be uncomfortable. Well, if the last year has taught us anything, then we've got to get uncomfortable. So I think change happens when we put ourselves in a position to get uncomfortable through empathy.
Thank you, James. I wonder whether you can say a little bit more about the bank's response as well. What do you feel that the bank's response should be? As one of the oldest banks in the world, there must be some kind of link in your history, both in NatWest and Coutts, with slave traders, I would imagine, certainly managing their wealth, I would imagine. So what about the bank's perspective? What's the bank's response need to be, do you think?
Okay, thank you. So this is a big topic, and Robert's really the expert on reparations, and has done a brilliant piece that if you've not seen it, have a look on YouTube for The Empire Pays Back. It's a brilliant 45-piece documentary on reparations. And although it's 15 years old, every single bit of it is still relevant today. So if I may, Adrian, it's not something that I can just give a really flippant answer to very quickly, okay? Or else it will just come across as vacuous and empty. So if you'll permit me to have just 2 or 3 minutes to do justice to the first part. So look, the bank has, over the last 15 years, researched its links with slavery very thoroughly. I think the report that we've put together has taken almost 2,000 hours to complete. And to understand why it takes so much time, we're made up of many smaller banks, over 100 smaller banks that the bank's acquired over the years. In London, Bristol, Glasgow, Edinburgh, Dundee. The one thing a lot of those cities have in common is links to the slave trade, okay? So needless to say, like many banks that are older than 200 years, we have uncomfortable links to slavery. One of those banks, Citizens, actually issued a report on its links to slavery in response to an ordinance from the city of Chicago that required them to do so if they wanted to continue to trade. Now, that's important because it was the city of Chicago that effectively triggered the only banks who have really done anything in this space, JP Morgan, Wachovia, a handful of others, in 2005. And off the back of that, Citizens, the bank we owned, they committed $5 million to African-American community projects, it wasn't directly presented as reparation. It was announced alongside the findings of the investigation of the historic links with slavery. So the bank's done a lot on this. What did we conclude? So Adrian, your question is, ultimately Coutts is an old bank. What's its history? So it doesn't matter that the report didn't find any direct ownership of slaves by the bank. The reality is that the bank has gained significant benefits in the 18th, 19th, and 20th centuries through our connection to the slave trade or slave-produced goods. We've got financial benefits, power, status, influence, information, power. All of that is wealth. So there is this uncomfortable truth that we have a shared responsibility for the benefits that we've got. Now, there's two schools of thought here, aren't there? There are those who say we can't change the past, and we're going to only focus on the future. And I think in doing so, they miss the point that I completely agree with Robert, that without some degree of repentance, there is no reparation, there's no repair. Of course, the difficulty is that all the people who are involved or who directly benefited from the slave trade are no longer around. Now, I'm a lawyer, so if you're going to run a legal argument on this, you won't get very far. There are lots of court cases in the States that have been unsuccessful on this. You don't get very far on a legal analysis. But I also know as a lawyer that actually people use those as a bit of an excuse to actually duck the real issue. And the real issue is, if we've benefited, what are we going to do about that? Now, the bankers, off the back of the task force, we've appointed an advisory board to help us off the back of the investigations we've done to decide what we do next on reparations. So that advisory board will consider the question, essentially, which I think is a moral leadership question of, are we going to pay reparation? Okay, are we going to make reparation, whatever that reparation is? And it's a moral leadership point because, as I said, you won't get a logical legal answer to it. It has to come from a place of value and purpose. Now, the bank's purpose, i.e. the stated reason why the NatWest Group exists, and if any of you are NatWest clients, then this may be news to you, but our purpose is to help people to thrive. To help people to thrive, their families, their communities, people to thrive. Well, this is where we break out of an Adrian, a bank answer to a James answer, okay? You know, my view is that communities can thrive a lot better when they believe that the people that they trust, and in our case, banks have to be a position of trust, are transparent. So I think reparation has to include transparency of our history, publishing our archives, publishing all that information. It's not our history, it's history. And it's important to people around what the bank has done. You know, Adrian, you talk about, you know, we may not have owned slaves, but we lent to people who did. We took security over slaves as though they were property, as though they were chattels, right? That is unacceptable and deserves some proper examination. And then the final thing is, if you've made that moral leadership stance of there is a case to pay, then the answer is how you do that. Now, I'm over the first line. I'm over the first line personally. And therefore, I'm really proud that the bank has already, Coots, the bit that I'm responsible for, in the last 4 years, the Coots Foundation has paid out £750,000 to three charities that particularly benefit Black and minoritized women, not exclusively in Afro-Caribbean community, but largely. I'm really pleased about that, but we didn't do it when with links to reparations, Adrian. We did it because it's linked to our purpose. And I suppose that takes us to, I guess, the really complex arguments, which, you know, I'd love to hear from both Robert and Suzann on this. But, you know, for me, it's a really tangible demonstration of our disapproval of the indefensible activities of the past. And I think if you make reparations, it takes away the charity label. We're not doing it for charity, we're doing it because people are entitled to that it's a redistribution. I think on the flip side, I think Barack Obama said around this whole complex issue that, you know, part of the problem with reparations is that people say, I've paid reparation, I'm done. And I think actually you have to think about your duty. Personally, I think about my duty as a banker to the community not necessarily because of things that happened generations and generations ago that I didn't have responsibility for, but actually what are my duties today? And actually, I think my duty is to minority areas who suffer from discrimination and oppression, regardless of the past. But don't let that take away from the fact, I still think there's a place for reparation, but actually, I think that comes from a place that we should be doing the right thing anyway. And inherent moral guilt is something that's quite troublesome, because people might just say, I have no inherent moral guilt, I had nothing to do with it, therefore I'm not going to help. Whereas actually, I think there's a duty that comes from the privilege that we carry, that I was nothing to do with it, but I still benefit from it as a result of the privilege that was earned by me. So thank you for giving me the time to answer that in detail. As I said, I'm not the expert.
No, but work in progress in terms of the bank's response, it sounds like that. Suzann, what anything you'd like to add to what's been said already in terms of what you think needs to happen next?
I agree with both Robert and James that really I think curriculum needs to change. You know, just in preparing to write the book, in reading lots of research, it really took me on a journey. And you know, as a Black woman, when I read newspaper articles, I can clearly see the bias and the racism and, you know, the stereotypes in there. There's really interesting research that has come out of Vienna, and they, you know, they've done lots of analysis on it, and they believe that really when journalists write stories like that, they're not necessarily being racist. It's just, you know, the way that they operate. What they're doing is portraying social representations. But then, so when I read that research, I was quite conflicted, because I felt really, you know, people need to take responsibility for what they write. But as you know, begin to dig into it, you know, looking at what the research says, what the data says, actually the school curriculum is at the heart of it, because people see the curriculum as truth. It's key at, you know, creating in-group and out-group narratives. And so really, I think if we are going to have change in the future generation, then the curriculum is one of the key things that needs to shift. We need to really have a truthful, you know, agenda or curriculum. So I would say that.
Education again. Thank you,
Yeah.
Suzann. That's really helpful. We're going to move fairly soon to questions in the panel, for the panel, but thank you for answering those three core questions of our conversation this evening. Before I hand over to Simon to manage that and to keep those questions coming in, we can see there have been a number of conversations happening in the chat already. I'd just like to share, in a sense, something quite personal about my own response and an initiative that we are starting in response to the events of the last year and what we've been learning ourselves. So let me just spend a few minutes, if I may, looking at that together. I guess what I'm about to share with you is born out of the personal impact on me of George's death. I guess I thought I was pretty switched on for the issues of racism, diversity and inclusion. After all, I run training programs on this stuff, for goodness sake, so surely I know my stuff. But it was after George's death and some of the listening assemblies that we held in the men's group in our church in South London that made me feel, in many ways, I was back in kindergarten. Many Black brothers started sharing for the first time with me and with other white brothers about their lifelong experience of racism. And, something they never really talked much about with us before, much with themselves. And it started to open up, to be honest with you, a whole new horrible world of reality that I just wasn't aware of, that so many of my Black friends actually had this daily experience, lifelong experience of racism and the impact that had on them. And I remembered the words of a Black female colleague that spoken to me 20 years before when the Stephen Lawrence inquiry came out. And that was, Adrian, unless you're part of the solution, you're part of the problem. So it's born out of that desire to do something, to be a part of the solution, that we are launching the White Allies Network today. But I want to unpack the name, because every one of those words in that name have been challenged in conversations I've had with a variety of people. And first of all, the word white. Why white rather than all allies? You know, isn't this, aren't you separating things out? Shouldn't we be getting together and working on this as an issue? For me, I think it needs to be called white allies because, first of all, we need to own our whiteness. Suzann, really, in one of her bullet points, almost described my life, my mindset, my experience, and James and Robert have both touched on it as well. The white privilege that we have, we need to acknowledge, and it's about our whiteness. It's not saying there aren't any other issues which we might suffer from, whether it be sexism, whether it be homophobia, whether it be classism, or whatever it might be. But my whiteness is not a problem for me in terms of me being discriminated because of my skin. And that's not the experience of those with a different color skin to my own. And so owning my whiteness and the privilege it brings, I think, is a really important first step. Also, and all of our panel members have touched on this already, many of us are woefully behind in our understandings of the issues. My history lessons at school, the only time they touched on the slave trade was producing the hero of Wilberforce in terms of his role in it all. It completely ignored the struggle of those that were enslaved, the example of people like Pastor Sam Sharp in the Caribbean, the hundreds that died that actually enabled and set the groundwork, if you like, for the abolition of slavery to actually take place. And so we are woefully unaware of most of our history, I think, that we really need to get much better at. Education, absolutely everything there. And I believe that we have a special responsibility as white people to step up and make this our issue too. Maybe it's our issue mainly, because if our ancestors set this whole system of privilege up and enslavement up, then maybe we have a special responsibility to lead in this area. And to respond to the challenge of Reniero Lodge in her book, Why I'm No Longer Talking to White People About Race. White people need to talk to white people about race. It needs to be a conversation that we have. I think something else that James touched on too is that it's scary for us quite often. And what we found within our context in our church in South London is that some questions only come to the fore in white-only spaces. And so being able to have a space where people feel without a fear of offending to actually unpack their ignorance and some of their fears and some of their questions, I think is really important. So that's the reason why I am unashamedly calling it a White Allies network. But allies is the other question I was asked. What right have you got? In fact, Layla Saad said it very, very clearly. Allyship is not self-defined. Our work and our efforts must be recognized by the people we seek to ally ourselves with. And in response to that challenge, you're absolutely right. It's a really good point. And so we are making sure that we are calling ourselves aspiring allies only. We cannot actually call ourselves allies. And it's also the reason why we've asked a number of people to join us in a council of reference. These are people of color, and I'm so delighted to say that both Suzann and Robert have been willing to actually be a part of that council of reference for us, to make sure that what we are doing is truly helpful. We're not getting into some kind of white saviorism or any other kind of distortion really of what being a true ally is. And so our council of reference will help us with that. But also we recognize we need open dialogue spaces as well. If we're to develop that empathy that's already been talked about, we need to be able to talk between people with skin of all colors, which is why in terms of the network, we are having quarterly meetings. Yes, quarterly, there will be some white spaces in that, but we will also have open spaces, and we'll alternate those spaces so that there are some which are open to all to join us. And also because of that, we have two types of membership, which we invite everyone to join the network on. One is the aspiring white allies for white people, but also we invite people of color to be co-mentors with us, co-mentor members, so that we can have those dialogue in those open spaces with you, so we can learn from it, if you are prepared to go with us in this journey. Now, something I've also learned is that we can lean too heavily on people who suffer from discrimination and racism for our education. There's something a bit obtuse about that, I think, if we over-rely on people with black and brown skin. It's like asking the abused to teach the abuser somehow. There's something, I don't know, which doesn't feel comfortable about that. It's not saying that we have to learn from people with different experiences from us, but our key responsibility as white people, I think, is to educate ourselves. And there's lots of resources around for that right now. So we have our first inaugural meeting on the 30th of June. If you are interested in joining us on this, whether you're a white person or a person of color, then do find out more at www.whiteallies.net and sign up if you can to join us in the process. And just to leave you, before I hand over to Simon, just with a quote from Martin Luther King, which has really challenged me and is a part of what my thinking is around this. Injustice everywhere, anywhere, is a threat to justice everywhere. We are caught in an inescapable network of humanity, of mutuality, tied in a single garment of destiny. Whatever affects one directly affects all indirectly. And so that's the kind of philosophy behind the White Allies Network. So without any further delay, though, we're going to get onto your questions, onto question time. I'm going to stop sharing my screen so that Simon can take over at this point in the process.
Okay, thank you, Adrian. Yeah, and thanks for all your questions. We've got some really good questions in the chat box, which I've been collating as we've been talking. Please continue to post your questions into the chat box. Alternatively, if you want to hang around and ask your own question, we can do that in the open mic session. So starting off with the questions, I'm going to start with Robert, if that's okay. But this is probably a question which all of the panel members might have a view on. So Robert, we've got a question from Daniel, who said, white fragility is a thing. Do we give up trying to get the fragile people on board and focus on those already keen to be an ally?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think we learn from history, and history suggests that you're never going to get everybody on board, and sometimes you just have to run, literally, with the one or two people who are willing to follow you or go with you, and often that small group can have a great impact. You know, so if we take, for example, one of the most iconic pictures in the Olympics in the late 20th century, the Olympics, the Mexico Olympics, where Tommy Smith and John Carlos give the Black Power salute. And they're only able to do that because beforehand they arranged with the Australian sprinter who came third if he is willing to allow them to make this gesture, and they can't do it without him. And he agrees. And you know, and he pays as big a price as Tommy Smith and John Carlos. He's never allowed to run in the Olympics again. You know, so that one single white ally led to an iconic moment, which had an international impact. Most people weren't aware of Black Power movement issues facing African Americans. So, you know, as my mother always says, one with God is the majority.
I wonder if I can just push you a little bit further on that one, Robert. So I think there's something in the question there about how do we work with the perceived apathy? Yeah,
well, you know, the way that I tend to work is on the basis that Jesus always had 3 or 4 people you could really trust on. So whenever there's a healing, look at the New Testament, there's always, you know, a couple of people Jesus could, you know, depend on to have the faith. And there's 3, isn't there? You know, then outside the 3, you get the 12. And then outside the 12, there's the 70. You know, and then outside of that, there's the crowd. So often you can only run with a few people who've got the vision for what you want to do. And maybe outside of the 3 or 4, there's the 12, and some of them are a bit shaky, different motivations or whatever. And then outside of that, you get the 70 of the masses. So if the Jesus model is anything to go by, you know, it's not really about the numbers. It's about the commitment.
Yeah, thanks, Robert. What about yourself, Suzann? What's your take on this issue of white fragility, and, you know, do we just focus our efforts on the people that are willing to be allies?
I think we need to keep going. I think talking about race can be emotive. Whatever colour you are, there can be eruptions from all communities. I think, you know, in terms of after the transatlantic slave movement, so the hierarchy of race was brought in. So white, you know, it's like a pyramid. So white people were at the top, brown people in the middle, and black people at the bottom. And that's what's been perpetuated in society. But the way that's been perpetuated is that white has become normalized. So then obviously to start having conversations around race and to start, you know, bringing to attention, you know, calling people white, or to start looking at whiteness is obviously, you know, uncomfortable, and there will be a strong reaction. But you know, today on this webinar we have lots of white, you know, people, we have black people, and I think we just keep going and we keep sharing the message and doing the work that we can to, you know, to bring change.
Thanks, Suzanne. And your answer there has prompted me to jump to another question from Judy, who talked about, she made, when Adrian was talking, he used the phrase people of colour, and Judy asked the question, when did white stop being a colour?
Yeah, so that's the thing, white has been normalised, so people can get really offended. You know, do you remember Jon Snow, when he referred to, there was some protests, and he, you know, he said on the news, I've never seen so many white people, and it was a protest in response to Brexit. And there was absolute outrage at him saying that. And that's part of the journey, that we're starting to talk about race, which means we're starting to talk about all races. And for, you know, to be called white, or to be labelled white, or for people to be, you know, called white, can be very, as I say, uncomfortable. And so, yeah, white is a colour. But I think with the status quo, it hasn't been labelled as a colour. So that's something that we're working on now, isn't it?
Yeah. Can I just add something to that? Just two things to be aware of. Look, we're all on a journey. You know, I work with LGBTQ members of staff, colleagues, and sometimes I get tripped up with all the terminology. I really do. And I say to them, I'm old enough and I've done enough to be given some grace, you know? And so I say that, you know, they give it to me gracefully, but I also extend it. We're all on a learning journey, and sometimes I get the language wrong, the concepts wrong, and they explain to me why they frame things in a particular way. So I think, you know, using people of colour, it's an African-American term. It works in terms of describing people who are non-white. It comes out of a particular historic understanding. However, yes, we realise that there is another history where, if you're as old as me, when you used to go to multicultural evenings, it was everybody except the white people stand. And we knew that what that really meant was that everybody else was a colour and the norm was whiteness. So I can see where you're going with that, but that's all part of the learning experience. Not everybody went to steel band, sari and samosa evenings in the 1970s in Coventry like me. We're able to identify that reality, you know. They were great days, good times, but they were problematic. So we're all learning, we're on that journey. There's grace as well as, you know, learning from these experiences. So I just want to unpack that comment a bit.
Yeah, thank you. James, can I come to you on that one? Because I get, in your role as your diversity champion at Coots, and I've had that experience myself with some organisations, linking to what Robert's saying there around, you know, sometimes the term, it might get tripped up on the terminology, and I think that can be a contributor towards this white fragility. You know, this, am I saying the right thing? Am I saying it in front of the right people or the wrong people? What kind of experiences have you had around white fragility with Coots?
Oh, thank you, Simon. Well, I don't mind putting my hand up and saying I've made some real howlers over the years in terms of what I've said. I've always attempted to do so from the right intentions. And I'm just grateful to people like Robert who have extended grace to me. I remember one particularly wonderful event at Coots where we had 300 clients, and we were raising awareness of an LGBT topic, actually. And I found myself being barracked by somebody about, you know, I was honest enough to say that I had a Christian faith, and he was really laying into me about, you know, the church's history on topics on the oppression of LGBT. And in the corner of my eye, somebody joined the conversation. I could only focus on this person to challenging me. This person joined the conversation, and it was Patricia Scotland, Baroness Scotland. For any of you who know Baroness Scotland, she's currently head of the Commonwealth. She was one of the first Black MPs, and wonderful woman of faith. And of course, he immediately stopped and gave her respect, because it was Baroness Scotland who put forward the first bill for civil partnerships when she was an MP. And I tell that story because, frankly, I was out of my depth, right? I wanted to do the right thing. I didn't know the right terminology. Because of the connections I had, whether they were fair or not fair. This person never stopped to ask me my views on LGBT. They just badged me or something. But because of the credibility that Patricia Scotland had, there was grace extended. And I think to address this comment head on, Simon, I get things wrong, but I'm open to feedback and I don't take offense. And that feedback isn't going to stop me, right? That feedback's just going to make me a better version of myself. And I think it was Judy who made the comment. Judy, thank you also. You made some comments on some of the language I used about slave owners. Of course, nobody can own a slave because everyone's born free. And I should have used the term traffickers. Absolutely right. But no one's ever pulled me up on that before. So people, decolonization is a work in progress. And we will get there together when we challenge each other, knowing that it's not going to put us off. Because the thing that is the biggest final thing, Simon, the resistance comes in all shapes and sizes, right? And we get people challenging us all the time, putting us off the scent with lots of arguments as to why we should or shouldn't do anything. The biggest resistance, the worst resistance, is silence. It's silence, because nothing changes with silence. Everything that status quo just continues. So I think the best possible thing we can do is speak up, even if we're going to get it wrong, allow ourselves to be graciously challenged, and then we will not make the same mistakes. And I was once told, please call me a woman of color, right? So I've called people a woman of color ever since. Other people weren't like that, but until they tell me, I won't know. So I think avoid silence, deal with grace. I couldn't agree more.
I think that's what brilliant tips, James. Really, really helpful to hear that from you. Thank you. So education came up as a theme in some of those answers towards the end of the panel questions there. And Roy asked a question. If you don't mind, Robert, I'll come to you first. So how can we influence changing the school curriculum following the Sewell report?
Yeah, it's a really good question. I think there's two things you can do. One is, within the national curriculum, there's space for exploring diversity, diverse histories and identities. It's just that unless the teacher wants to push a particular theme, it isn't discussed. So you can always ask your history teacher, when your kids go in school, what areas of African Caribbean history you're looking at, and is it just all the slave trade? Is it a bit more complex? Are there any other additional resources that you use? So you can push teachers to address those issues. Then there's the extracurricular stuff. My son's school in particular did some really good stuff around George Floyd. They had assemblies. They have that other class, that PSI, I keep calling it, but it's that human development thing. It used to be general studies back in my day. They have that class where they cover some of the issues as well. But what I found really, really important, if we believe that more things are caught than taught, is how the teachers are in addressing issues holistically across the school. Has quite a profound impact. You should always look out for how teachers address issues of race and racism anyway, because that's often where the real learning takes place. Outside of school, I think the church, and I'm still a believer in Sunday school. Now, Sunday school can be a great place to produce it does. It produces a subversive discourse because it's valuing all human beings. It's presenting a different view of the world and world history. But it can be a great place to challenge all the learning that takes place within school. An example of this to finish is if you ever get the opportunity to watch online, Barack Obama's old church, Trinity United Church of Christ, that was headed by great Jeremiah Wright. Now it's Otis Moss III. Just look at the iconography of the church, you know, completely revolutionary, inclusive, you know, doing something through the visuals. When we went there and we looked at the Sunday school class, the kids in Sunday school were painting Old Testament characters, different shades from teak to mahogany, recognizing this is the Middle East. Middle East of where? Of Europe. Well, that's Eurocentrism. They're being taught this in Sunday school. You know, so the kids were developing a critical consciousness in Sunday school. You know, and I mean, the bar, you can see why Barack Obama went there. You can't teach Sunday school in that church without a degree, because they take it that seriously. Christian education is really valued. You can't run a ministry without a PhD. I mean, these people are snobs. It's hardcore. You know, my goodness, that hard work. Listen, this is God's work. You know. So you can use that space to challenge. You just got to be careful how you do it. I used to do a thing on human sexuality, but they stopped me because I used to get them kids to draw a picture of the Apostle Paul when Paul says about the body of Christ. Teenagers, he says their heads, hand. I said, what's missing? The midriff. See, because Paul doesn't deal effectively with that. One way, their parents didn't like that. They said, do the race stuff, leave the gender out.
Thanks, Robert. You mentioned system change earlier, but I think it was in the first question you talked about system change, right? And yes, some really good ideas for people there about influencing. You know, we could call it bottom up if we're speaking with teachers, etc. What about ideas about kind of broader policy change and governmental change in terms of curriculum?
Yeah, I think that's another really good question. If Foucault, the French philosopher, is correct, then power comes from the bottom up. It doesn't come from the top down. So really, if we're looking at mobilizing people for change, we need to start with communities. So I said, start with the church communities. Back in my day, when the state wasn't working for us educationally, we set up Saturday schools. That's why, look, Saturday schools had profound influence. Problem was we let the government start to fund them, and then when they took the funding away, they disappeared. Ask Kehinde Andrews, Professor of Black Studies. First, where did you learn this Saturday school? It's people like me teaching there. You ask Akala, the rapper, what kept you on track? I had to go to Saturday school. That's where I learned all the history. I'm not joking. You know, the list, I could keep going on and on and on. So ultimately, if we want to have agencies, people of God, then I think we have to set up the alternative structures. We can't wait on Boris Johnson. We're waiting for a long time. If we're waiting on this government. So I think there's a real creative opportunity to set up something different and using the church, Christian communities as a springboard. How wonderful it would be to be able to form young Christian minds in Sunday school in a way that's powerfully revolutionary, inclusive, to learn a language of justice and a practice that means that everybody they come into contact with are truly astounded by their capacity to discern people by who they are on the inside. That's what we should be doing in Sunday school. So I'm much more interested in the alternative spaces rather than relying on the state and policy. We are the change that people need to see. And it's one of the reasons why, look, I've always worked in working class, working poor universities, you know, not because I can't get a job anywhere else. I can do that elitist stuff, you know, I write books and speak about the future eschatological manifestation as an epitome of revolutionary omniscience. I can do all that stuff. It's easy. The hard stuff is saying, can we develop pathways for the poorest people, the most disadvantaged kids, to experience higher education? It used to be free then. It's costing $9,000 now per year. It's a bit more of a hard sell. So for me, I've always worked on the basis that I've got to make the change, put myself in the position, set up the structures, and if people want to follow, they follow. We can't wait for the state. It won't happen. Boris Johnson.
Thank you, Robert. James, did you want to come in there?
No, I was just applauding, Robert.
Applauding, okay, you're applauding. Okay, and in that case, you got a lot of applause actually there, Robert. I saw lots of hands going up around there. I've got one more question then for Suzann, and then we'll move to an open mic, and you can just pile in with your questions as you wish. So Suzann, this was a question from Roy, who asked about, in your training, did you come across cross-cultural counselling theories? And is this something that you think we need to develop our understanding of?
Yeah, I mean, we had a lot of training around diversity. I think in general, you would really need to be aware of difference when you're in the room, because if you don't do the work around difference, then when the client comes in, you can, make assumptions about the client. And, you really need to just do the work so that when you're in the room, it's the client and the content informing the room. So we did do lots of training around cross-cultural training and diversity, and they do try to drive it, especially with the I talked about the roundtables, so I think that's really on the agenda, that people go through that process, and yeah, we did, and it's hugely important.
Great, thank you.
Yeah.
Thank you, Suzann. And thank you to all the panel members there. Some really, really good answers. There's more and more comments coming in on the chat box, but have to be honest, they're too long for me to I can't copy and paste on the Zoom. So I might invite some people in we'll do an open mic now, and feel free to jump in. Judy, you've put some really good contributions into the chat box. Wondered if you wanted to come in, Judy, and say anything to the panel members.
Actually, Simon, can I just say something briefly first, because we need to turn off the recording now for people's open mic bits. But also, I just wanted to to make the point. A lot of people have talked from the perspective of the Christian faith, but we have I'm privileged to say we have Rabbi Elf who's joined us for the webinar, and he runs a Faith and Black Lives Matter network in Manchester area. So welcome, Rabbi, because justice is a theme of all the Abrahamic faiths, isn't it? We're just going to need to make sure that we kind of acknowledge that, and also those of other faiths and beliefs as well. So I just wanted to kind of make sure we made that point before we went on. But welcome, Rabbi, and all those that have joined us from that Manchester network as well. So
thank you.
Okay. Thank you so much for listening to the recording of this webinar held on the first anniversary of George Floyd's death. Do check out our philosophy and our work at Deeper Leaders at our website, www.deeperleaders.com. We like to think our approach to leadership and organisational development is refreshingly different. And do consider joining the White Allies Network at www.whiteallies.net. If you sign up on our site, you will have free and ongoing access to a growing hub of videos, articles and blogs to help us all fill in the gaps in our education and help us be much more effective allies against racism. There's more video material from Robert there too. And finally, do consider giving generously to the work of Blueprint for All and help us raise at least £1,000 for the important work they do with young people to help create inclusive communities where everyone can thrive. Thank you.